The Wallace family seemed like a postcard image of small-town life in 2006. Mark Wallace was a respected mechanic with a loyal clientele, known for his reliability and skill with cars. Susan Wallace was the epitome of a loving wife and mother, tirelessly dedicated to her two children, Emily and Jake, aged 6 and 4. Together, they participated in church events, community potlucks, and school plays, projecting an aura of harmony and stability. Mark's childhood, however, hid a darker chapter. His father, Thomas Wallace, had an affair decades earlier that resulted in the birth of a daughter, Lila Carter. Born out of wedlock and rejected by Thomas's family, Lila grew up with her mother in a neighboring town. Mark met Lila briefly at 17 when their father awkwardly arranged a meeting. While their initial interaction was tentative, the two grew close. Lila, feeling abandoned and unloved, found solace in Mark's attention. Over time, their connection deepened into an inappropriate bond that they both agreed to sever before it spiraled further. By 2006, Mark had buried the past. He married Susan and built a life that revolved around their family. Lila had become little more than a distant memory, and Mark convinced himself that his feelings were a youthful mistake, but unresolved emotions have a way of resurfacing. In 2010, a letter from Lila arrived at Mark's shop. It was a simple note, but its implications were enormous. Lila expressed her desire to reconnect, apologizing for her role in their past and hinting at lingering feelings. Torn between curiosity and dread, Mark agreed to meet her, believing he could provide closure. Their reunion took place at a secluded diner, where Lila shared stories of her troubled life. Now 33, she exuded confidence but carried visible scars of abandonment and hardship. Mark was struck by how much she had changed and found himself drawn to her. What began as a one-time meeting turned into a secret relationship. They met in motels on the outskirts of town, using burner phones to keep their communication hidden. Despite his better judgment, Mark continued the affair. Lila, however, grew more demanding, often hinting that their bond was destined. Her intensity frightened Mark, but he couldn't seem to extricate himself. His guilt mounted as he lied to Susan, who remained blissfully unaware of his duplicity. In early 2011, Susan's life began to unravel in small, unsettling ways. Mark, once attentive and loving, became increasingly distracted. He started working longer hours at his auto shop, often coming home late, and when he was home, he seemed distant. At first, Susan dismissed these changes as stress from work. However, as time went on, things began to feel off. One day, while doing laundry, Susan came across an unfamiliar scent on Mark's shirt, a faint trace of perfume she didn't recognize. It wasn't the usual scent she wore, nor did it match anything she had ever smelled on him before. Her mind began to race with suspicions, but she tried to brush it off, convincing herself that it could have been an innocent explanation. However, it only deepened her unease. A few weeks later, while cleaning Mark's jacket, Susan found a receipt for a local motel tucked in one of the pockets. It was dated for a night Mark claimed to have been working late. The receipt, showing the name of the motel, sent a wave of dread through her. She confronted Mark, but he brushed it off with excuses, claiming it was for a work-related meeting he had attended months ago. Still, Susan couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. The turning point came when Susan noticed late-night texts and phone calls on Mark's phone, often from an unknown number. On one occasion, she picked up his phone while he was in the shower and saw a message that sent a chill through her. "I miss you so much. Let's meet again soon." The realization hit her like a punch to the gut. Her husband was having an affair. After confronting Mark with the evidence, he admitted to the affair, but initially tried to downplay it, claiming it was nothing serious. Yet Susan soon discovered the truth, that the affair had been ongoing for months. Heartbroken and devastated, she demanded to know more, which led Mark to finally reveal the identity of his lover, Lila, the half-sister he had once met in his youth. The revelation stunned Susan even further, as she struggled to process the idea of Mark being romantically involved with someone from his past, let alone his own sister. Faced with the shocking truth about the affair, Susan sought to understand how Mark could have betrayed her in such an unimaginable way. She reached out to Mark's family hoping for answers, but her request for support only deepened the chaos. In June 2011, she arranged a family meeting in an attempt to address the affair and its devastating impact. The gathering took place at the Wallace family home, with Mark's parents, Susan's parents, and Lila's mother in attendance. The atmosphere was tense from the very start, as both families struggled to come to terms with the complicated and painful situation. Mark's mother, devastated by the betrayal, couldn't hold back her tears and anger. She blamed her husband for the affair from years ago, which had led to the birth of Lila, and for the subsequent emotional damage to their family. She blamed herself for not being able to keep her son from straying. Mark Mark's father, though emotionally distant, defended his son, trying to shift blame onto Lila for seducing Mark. Lila, for her part, appeared coldly composed. She seemed unmoved by the turmoil around her. Her calmness only heightened the tension in the room, as she boldly declared that she and Mark were destined to be together and that Susan was simply in the way. She referred to Susan as a spoiled wife who could never truly understand the connection she shared with Mark. Susan, overwhelmed with a mixture of anger, grief, and disbelief, confronted Lila, demanding to know why she had pursued an affair with her own half-brother. Lila's response was chilling. She claimed that their bond was fated and that Susan could not comprehend the depth of their relationship. Her words seemed to echo a disturbing obsession that Susan hadn't recognized until now. The family meeting spiraled out of control. Shouts and accusations filled the air, and nothing productive was achieved. As the meeting broke up, Susan realized that her marriage was likely irreparable. She demanded that Mark end all contact with Lila and seek therapy, but Mark was torn. While he promised to end the affair, the emotional tug of his relationship with Lila still held a strong grip on him. The psychological damage from the affair and the strained family dynamics created a toxic environment. The day Susan Wallace's life was violently taken from her began like any other. March 6, 2012 was a Tuesday, and Susan had planned to run errands, taking care of mundane tasks while juggling her responsibilities as a mother. She'd dropped off her daughter Emily at a friend's house and arranged to pick up their son Jake later that afternoon. There was nothing in her schedule to suggest the horror that awaited her. Mark, her husband, was working at his auto shop, and the atmosphere in their home had been tense for some time. After discovering his affair with Lila, Susan had been trying to reconcile her feelings, holding on to hope that Mark would end the relationship with his half-sister. However, as the days went on, it became clear that Mark wasn't fully committed to severing ties with Lila, which only deepened Susan's pain and mistrust. On that fateful day, Susan went about her routine, unaware that Lila had decided to take matters into her own hands. In the days leading up to the murder, Lila had grown more desperate. Her obsession with Mark was all-consuming, and her jealousy toward Susan had reached a boiling point. Lila had been keeping a watchful eye on Susan's movements, waiting for the right moment to strike. Lila arrived at the Wallace home unannounced, at a time when Susan was alone. The two women had always been civil to one another, but the underlying tension was undeniable. Lila's deep-seated animosity toward Susan had been simmering for months, fueled by her belief that she was meant to be with Mark. When Susan opened the door, she likely had no idea what Lila was capable of. The attack was brutal and swift. Lila, in a fit of rage, attacked Susan with a knife from the kitchen. The crime scene was gruesome. Blood spattered across the walls, and evidence of a struggle was evident, with furniture overturned and items scattered around the room. Susan fought valiantly to defend herself, but the physical strength of her attacker and the element of surprise worked in Lila's favor. Susan's life was taken in a savage manner, her throat slit in a calculated and violent act. Lila left the scene quickly, ensuring there was no immediate evidence to trace her directly, but her involvement in the murder would soon come to light. The police arrived at the Wallace home in the early afternoon after a concerned neighbor had found the door ajar and alerted authorities. When they entered, they discovered Susan's lifeless body in the living room, her murder immediately evident. The police began their investigation, but it wasn't long before Lila became the prime suspect. Evidence from the crime scene, including fingerprints on the murder weapon and nearby items, quickly linked Lila to the murder. Witnesses reported seeing her car near the house on the day of the murder, and Lila's bizarre behavior in the days following Susan's death raised further suspicions. However, Lila had already vanished. She was no stranger to evading detection. After the murder, Lila used false identities and moved from place to place to escape the growing manhunt. She was seen using different aliases at motels and was reportedly trying to make her way across state lines. For months, Lila remained elusive, hiding under the radar. Meanwhile, Mark was left in a state of shock. The murder of his wife, combined with the revelation that Lila had been involved, left him devastated. He had been torn between his guilt for betraying Susan and the still entangled feelings he harbored for Lila. Yet, as the police search intensified, it became clear that Mark's emotional turmoil was secondary to the urgent need to find the woman responsible for Susan's death. The hunt for Lila continued throughout 2012, with authorities receiving tips from across the country. Despite her efforts to remain hidden, the police were closing in. In July 2012, Lila was finally captured in a small town on the border, attempting to cross into Canada with a fake passport. She was arrested without incident and brought back to face charges for Susan's murder. Lila's trial began in 2013, a year after the brutal murder of Susan Wallace. The proceedings were highly publicized, drawing media attention and stirring public debates about family dynamics, obsession, and the extremes of infidelity. The trial was set to uncover the details behind Susan's murder, with Lila being the central figure in the courtroom. The prosecution presented a compelling case, outlining Lila's motive rooted in jealousy and obsession. They detailed her long-standing infatuation with Mark, which had spiraled into an unhealthy fixation. The affair between Lila and her half-brother Mark had strained Susan and Mark's marriage. Lila's emotions had become dangerously entangled, leading her to view Susan as the barrier between her and Mark. Witnesses testified that Lila had been fixated on Mark for years, even as she attempted to keep the affair hidden. The prosecution called on forensic experts who confirmed Lila's presence at the crime scene. Blood spatter analysis and DNA evidence placed her at the Wallace residence at the time of the murder. Additionally, they used the testimony of neighbors who had seen her car parked outside the house the day of the killing. The evidence painted a clear picture of premeditated murder, with Lila's obsession as the driving force behind the crime. On the defense side, Lila's attorney painted a picture of a woman emotionally scarred by her troubled childhood. Her mother was absent and her father's abandonment left deep wounds. The defense suggested that Lila's obsessive behavior was the result of a deep psychological break exacerbated by her turbulent past. They argued that while her actions were horrific, they were born out of a disturbed mind, unable to fully grasp the gravity of her crime. Lila herself was eerily calm throughout the trial, offering little emotion or remorse. Her demeanor was unsettling to those in the courtroom, especially as the prosecution and witnesses recounted the violent details of the murder. In a chilling moment, Lila even made statements that implied her belief that Susan's death had been justified, as though she had somehow won by removing the woman who stood between her and Mark. As the trial dragged on, Mark was called to testify. His appearance in court was heart-wrenching. He was a man caught in a tragic spiral of guilt, torn between his own actions, the affair with his half-sister, and the grief of losing his wife. Mark admitted to his affair with Lila, acknowledging that he had been complicit in the breakdown of his marriage. He expressed deep remorse for his role in the tragedy, but he also described his inability to break free from Lila's grip. His testimony was both emotional and damning, giving the jury insight into the complex relationship between the three. Despite the emotional nature of the defense's arguments, the overwhelming evidence of premeditation, violence, and lack of remorse led the jury to find Lila guilty of first-degree murder. The public and the Wallace family, although devastated, found a sense of justice in the conviction. The trial ended with the certainty that Lila would be held accountable for her actions, but it also revealed the complexities of the human psyche, how obsession can turn into destruction when unchecked. On March 15, 2013, Lila's trial reached its long-awaited conclusion. After days of intense testimony, emotional pleas, and a nail-biting deliberation, the jury returned a verdict that would send shockwaves through the courtroom, the families, and the public. Lila was found guilty of first-degree murder for the killing of her half-sister-in-law, Susan Wallace. The verdict was not just a legal victory, it was a moment of relief for Susan's family, who had been waiting for justice since the brutal murder nearly a year earlier. As the judge read out the verdict, there was a palpable silence in the courtroom. For Susan's parents and family members, it was a bittersweet moment of justice. They had lost a beloved daughter and sister, and though the conviction was a form of closure, it did not heal the wounds left by her senseless death. The defense tried to argue for a lesser sentence, pleading for Lila's troubled childhood and psychological issues, but the judge was resolute in upholding the first-degree murder charge, noting the premeditation and violent nature of the crime. Lila stood motionless in the defendant's box, her face emotionless as the verdict was read. She showed no signs of remorse, which only reinforced the chilling nature of the crime. Her lack of emotion during the trial had been unsettling for many in the courtroom, and now, as the verdict was delivered, it seemed that she remained disconnected from the gravity of her actions. The judge sentenced Lila to life in prison without the possibility of parole, ensuring that she would never be free again. The aftermath of Susan's death and Lila's conviction affected everyone involved, including those who had been close to the family. For Mark, Susan's husband and Lila's half-brother, the verdict was a devastating blow. He had already been emotionally broken by the murder, but now, the truth of his role in end the affair, and the tragedy of his actions settled even heavier on him. The affair he had with Lila, though it had been years in the past, had led to a breakdown of his marriage with Susan, ultimately setting the stage for her murder. While Mark was not directly involved in the killing, his betrayal of Susan's trust had been the catalyst for the events that followed. Mark was torn between feelings of guilt and disbelief. He had loved Susan and was devastated by her loss, but at the same time, his complicated relationship with Lila left him grappling with conflicting emotions. How could he have failed to see the danger that Lila represented? How could he not have understood the extent of her obsession and her capacity for violence? These questions haunted him, and he withdrew from public life to escape the constant media attention. The Wallace family, Susan's parents, were left to pick up the pieces of their lives. They were grateful for the conviction, but knew that no amount of justice would bring their daughter back. They struggled with the enormity of the loss. The Susan Wallace Memorial Fund, created in her honor, sought to raise awareness for domestic violence, infidelity, and obsessive behavior in relationships, while providing financial support to families who were affected by similar tragedies. It was a way for them to channel their grief into something positive, but it was never going to fully fill the void left by Susan's death. The community was rocked by the revelations of the trial. What had appeared to be a normal suburban family was now the center of a horrific tragedy. Neighbors, friends, and acquaintances who had once seen Mark and Susan as a loving couple were left shocked by the details that came to light. Lila's obsessive behavior, her affair with Mark, and the eventual murder seemed like the stuff of a twisted thriller, but it was all too real. The small community was forever changed by the knowledge that such a tragedy had occurred right under their noses. Lila's fate and the destruction of Susan's family also prompted wider discussions in the media about obsessive love, mental illness, and the destructive potential of hidden emotions. People began to reflect on how infidelity and obsessive attachments could sometimes spiral into tragedy if they weren't properly addressed. After the trial and verdict, Lila's life took a drastic turn. Sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, she was placed in a high-security facility where she would spend the remainder of her life behind bars. For Lila, the prison environment was nothing like the obsessive, self-centered world she had once known. Gone were the days of manipulating Mark or fantasizing about a future with him. In prison, Lila had to confront the reality of her situation. She was alone, and her actions had left her isolated from the world she once desired. Her obsession with Mark did not dissipate. Instead, it festered in her mind. Lila continued to send letters to Mark, filled with declarations of love and longing, but he never responded. She became increasingly delusional, writing in her journals and obsessing over the past. Psychologists who evaluated Lila noted that she exhibited signs of obsessive-compulsive disorder and borderline personality disorder. Her psychological state had been unstable long before the murder, and her actions were likely exacerbated by years of emotional trauma and a deep-seated need for control. However, despite psychiatric intervention and therapy, Lila's obsession with Mark remained a central part of her existence. She appeared unable to fully comprehend the magnitude of her actions or take responsibility for them. Lila's days in prison were marked by periods of extreme emotional breakdowns, often triggered by thoughts of Mark or reflections on her past life. Despite the treatment she received, she showed little progress in terms of emotional regulation. In the eyes of many, Lila's fate seemed sealed, and there was little hope for her rehabilitation. The only path forward was one of isolation, as she remained largely cut off from the outside world, consumed by her own delusions. As we come to the end of this tragic story, we are left with some difficult questions to answer. Why did this happen? Why did Lila, a woman with a complex psychological background, allow her emotions to spiral into such a horrific act of violence? Lila's actions raise questions about the nature of obsession and infidelity. How can something as seemingly normal as love and affection turn into something so dangerous? Was it Lila's childhood trauma and the emotional neglect she faced that led to her obsessive behavior? Or was it something more inherent in her personality, a deep-seated need to control and possess? Could Mark have done more to stop the affair and prevent the murder, or was he also a victim of Lila's manipulations? At the heart of this story is the idea that obsession can be just as destructive as hate. Love, when it becomes an all-consuming force, can blind someone to reason and reality, leading them down a dark path. The story of Lila and Susan is a reminder that unchecked emotions and unresolved psychological issues can have far-reaching and tragic consequences. As we reflect on this story, we encourage you to like and subscribe for more discussions on real-life events and psychological phenomena. Share your thoughts in the comments. What do you think led Lila to commit such a violent act? Do you believe that obsession can ever be justified, or is it always dangerous? What role does childhood trauma play in shaping a person's future actions? These are the kinds of questions that make us examine the depths of human behavior. What drives a person to murder? Is it truly just a momentary loss of control, or is there something deeper at play? Join the conversation, ask questions, and let's keep exploring these dark and complicated aspects of human nature.